Hello, everyone. We're back again to begin uh, our next presentation, and let me see which one it is here. Week 6. So we're back again to discuss Introduction to Caribbean Society. The material is taken from Franklin Knight's book, The Caribbean: Genesis of a Fragmented Nationalism. It's an excellent textbook. It combines history, economics, and sociology, and he is helping us understand how the social structures of the Caribbean developed in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, which led, in his view, to a fragmented sense of nationalism in the Caribbean. And so this is taken, I believe, from chapter 5. Let's just go ahead and jump in and continue with our study. So, week 6, Plantation Society, Franklin W. Knight, The Caribbean and the Genesis of a Fragmented Nationalism. By the way, if you're an FIU student, this book is available as an ebook in the library. I highly recommend it. Franklin Knight himself is a historian. He originates from Jamaica, and he attended the University of the West Indies. And I believe, I don't have here where he teaches currently, but he's been given a number of awards for his historical work. So today we're talking about Plantation Society. The slave labor plantations replaced the unsuccessful settler societies. Remember, last week and the week before, we talked about two different kinds of colonies or settler societies. One was what he calls a settler society, in which Europeans came to the New World and tried to duplicate their structures and their economic basis from Europe. Barbados started out like this in the early phase. Cuba and Puerto Rico was largely this kind of society until the 19th century. Uh, and he distinguishes those societies which usually have a majority of European or American born Creoles of European parents with a what he calls an exploitive uh, plantation complex or an exploitive colony, in which slave labor predominates to provide mass production of sugar, for example. And this kind of colony, there's a small number of white Europeans or Creole whites who dominate and command a large number of African born or American born blacks who are slaves who are doing coerced labor. That's the exploitive or the exploitation colony. And this would characterize Barbados after 1650, also the French Saint-Domingue, after it became a massive sugar producing island, and Cuba and other islands turned to this pattern in the 19th century with the heyday of their sugar production. The slave labor plantation complex inexorably succeeded the faltering attempts to create a viable settler society patterned after the European antecedents. In other words, as the European settler society failed, it was replaced by the slave labor plantation complex or the exploitive colony. They were societies with some unusual characteristics: predominantly male, predominantly adult, predominantly non-free, and relentlessly coerced. Nowhere throughout the plantation Caribbean did the enslaved social units procreate and maintain their demographic viability. In other words, the conditions were so harsh that the slave population could not maintain itself through reproduction. There had to be a steady influx of new slaves being brought from Africa. Um, and so This was because the conditions were harsh. They were not fed well, not good nutrition. I've read in other places that some slave owners did the calculus that they could get 7 years of good labor out of a slave, and they would buy the slave, feed them poorly, work them to death, and within 6 or 7 years buy a slave to replace them, rather than trying to allow them to have families and to reproduce and children to be raised. By the late 18th century, when the Caribbean slave society attained its highest stage of development, masters and slaves, merchants and shippers, rulers and ruled, free and non-free, white and non-white, constituted distinct castes and classes. The Afro-American Caribbean. Many 19th century writers portrayed the vast variegated region stretching from the North Atlantic seaboard to the northeast of Brazil, which they deemed Afro-America. I had no idea that the term Afro-America dated from the 19th century and also was used to include Caribbean peoples. The Mexican Gulf ports Tampico and Veracruz took precedence over the South American ports of Portobello and Cartagena. The typical slave society had 3 legally defined castes: the slaves, the free persons of color, and the white persons. Here's a quick pic of the Caribbean. By the way, this is taken from a online game, map game that you can find if you just do a Google search for online map game for the Caribbean. It's a great way to memorize the locations of the islands. The racialization of slavery. Slaves were slaves only because they were bought as such and condemned legally to that status. I have to turn my phone off, sorry. Slaves were slaves because they were bought as such and condemned legally to that status. Originally, the relationship with the African descent was merely coincidental. So in the very beginning, slavery was not color-based. It was based on a lot of different life circumstances, but the word slave comes from the word Slav. So Slavic peoples were enslaved under the Roman Empire and throughout the Middle Ages. So slaves could be white, they could be black, they could be from the Muslim world, the Middle East. So this was true at the beginning of the period of the modern period of the conquest and settlement of the Caribbean, was that slavery was not necessarily color-based in 1492 or 1510. Slaves were, in the earliest period of the constructing the complex, slaves and servants were often interchangeable. Labels applied indiscriminately to servile Europeans or Africans. Remember, this is a Caribbean Jamaican saying this from his textbook. This is not a justification of slavery, as we shall see. But by the end of the 17th century, the term slave connotated African origin and menial occupation. There was a massive profits that were available in the slave trade, and when whites were brought over forcibly, sometimes kidnapped in Bristol and brought forcibly as indentured servants, they had a certain term of service. Some of them did not survive because their conditions were appalling, but they had a certain term of service and their children couldn't be enslaved. Also, there was some feeling in parts of Europe that Christians should not be enslaved. Therefore, if a slave converted to Christianity, there was some argument that they should be released from their esclavitude. However, if slavery was based on color, then it could be permanent with no term of service, and their children could also be born into slavery. So there was a massive financial motivation to develop a permanent characteristic to identify slaves. Very disturbing. There was also a social pyramid. The conventional demographic profile of the slave society was that of a narrow-peaked triangle horizontally divided into three segments. The broad base of this triangle represented the vast majority of slaves. Africa-born slaves were called bozales in Spanish, while those born in the Americas were called Creoles or Afro-Americans. Here is the pyramid with whites at the top, at the peak, and blacks or the enslaved at the bottom, at the base, and in the middle are the coloreds and free blacks. Mestizos or mulattoes. There was a degree of vagueness, uncertainty, overlap, and social passing on a limited scale. Slaves could become members of the free colored community, and occasionally free coloreds could become members of the white community. This was more true in Latin America and the Caribbean than it was in the United States, where there was a very rigid color line between black and white, and if you had a slight amount of black blood, you were considered black. Miscegenation between imported African slaves and all other ethnic groups also produced a new mixed blood substratum of individuals designated as mestizo or mulatto, who fell into the categories of slave or free. Eventually, the mixed population formed the middle band of the triangle. And here we see a painting that shows a variety of degrees or distinctions of color in a plantation society. Skin color and social status. On the plantations, as well as in the cities, the color of one's skin immediately and effectively fixed both social position and occupation, with blackness indicating a low status and arduous menial labor, and whiteness indicating superiority and leisure. In general, there was a preponderance of Africans and Afro-Americans in the exploitive colonies. This is what Franklin Knight has been saying, is that the exploitation colonies had an unusual and unique social structure with a vast majority of slaves or blacks and a small minority in control of white elites. In the English and French Caribbean during the 18th and early 19th centuries, the white population only represented between 3 and 11% of the total colonial population. And we're going to talk about women in the plantation societies and their role. Complexity among people of color. Other subtle distinctions soon followed. Slaves born in the Caribbean felt socially superior to their relatives and colleagues who were not. Field slaves were the backbone of the plantation economy. One frequently overlooked aspect of plantation slavery was the high degree of participation by women in all aspects of field and factory labor. And here's a painting of Caribbean African women or women of color with their children. Female slaves, women worked in the fields much longer on the average than men, probably corresponding to their longer life expectancy. Males were put to a fairly wide range of occupations, whereas females were confined almost entirely to field or domestic tasks. Barbados appeared to be unique in the region for its large gangs of young children working in the fields under the supervision of a female driver. It leaves one's heart heavy. Occupations. On sugar estates, the skill and experience of the master sugar boiler was highly valuable for the economic success of the enterprise. Often female slaves operated as itinerant or fixed vendors, competing with the free and white merchants. Slaves also operated small coastal boats and were fishermen, musicians, craftsmen, guides, rat catchers. Any job that provided an income and were not or could not be adequately filled by the free population fell to the slaves. And here is a painting that shows here's a painting that shows the complexity of the Spanish conception of pureza de sangre, or color distinctions. Spaniards were very obsessed with color and the degree of mixture in their blood. It had something to do, going back to the conflict with the Moors in Spain in the presence of a Jewish population. And so here it only shows 16 different possible combinations, but the author, Franklin Knight, says there were up to 25. The Spanish managed to get 25 possible hybrid variations in their range of color, although only a small number of descriptions were precise enough to be practically useful. They were subdivided into mulattoes, the offspring of a white and a black; sambos, the offspring of a black and a mulatto; quadroons, the offspring of a mulatto and a white; and mestis or mestizos, the offspring of a quadroon and a white. Below this last denomination, the distinction of color was hardly perceptible. Here's another picture of Plantation Society with, again, a variety of different shades and hues of color. Social restrictions on free coloreds. The whites often used their political power to increase the social distance between themselves and the free colored sector. Laws distinguishing comportment, dress, residence, or denying the practice of certain occupations, or limiting the material inheritance of the free colored population, were commonplace throughout the Caribbean during the early 19th century. This is boundary vigilance or boundary watching. Whites trying to maintain their privileges. And even within the whites, there was conflict and tension between European-born whites and Creole or American-born whites. Throughout the 18th century, therefore, the French Antilleans sought to restrict intermarriage across ethnic boundaries and curtail non-white participation in shipping, commerce, and the military. The Jamaica Assembly passed an act in 1762 restricting the inheritance of any free person of color to no more than 2,000 pounds sterling. Free colored militias. One area of colonial life in which the free coloreds found ready opportunities for service was in the military. Gradually, free colored males were organized into separate militia units designed to serve alongside the whites in local defense. This was particularly true in Cuba at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. Between 1600 and the 1800s, the number of free colored militia companies increased from 1 to 16 in Cuba, and nearly 1/3 of all the local militia came from the free colored sector. The conspiracy of the latter. This comes directly from Spanish. Another translation is the conspiracy of the lash, or the year of the lash. In 1789, Saint-Domingue, I'm trying to pronounce it correctly in French, Saint-Domingue, erupted at the height of its prosperity, and the society experienced the first thorough revolution in the Western Hemisphere. The change went far beyond the political rearrangement. Now, that's a reference to the American Revolution, which some call the American War of Independence, which was only political. The only change at the top was a political change of the American-born colonists replaced the British-born royalists. It was not, the American War of Independence was not a social revolution, and it wasn't really an economic revolution. The same people had the money at the end of the wars at the beginning. But the Haitian Revolution was not only a political revolution, it was a thoroughgoing social revolution and an economic revolution. In 1834, the British government accepted the abolition of slavery throughout the empire. These changes that were going on, especially the Haitian Revolution, created a great deal of insecurity and fear among some of the Creoles in Latin America. which is one reason why some of them resisted the Spanish Wars of Independence, particularly Cuba. Any ideas of a war of independence from Spain at the time of the Venezuelan and Argentine uprisings was quashed because Cuban elites were terrified that the same thing would happen to them that happened to the French elites in Saint-Domingue. So in 1844, the Cuban whites, basing their actions on a presumed island-wide conspiracy, decimated the intellectual and economic leadership of the Afro-Cuban population. This was like a preventative. This was a preventative to keep the blacks of Cuba from uprising against their elite white plantation masters. And this is why Cuba didn't become independent from Spain when the rest of Latin America did until the end of the 19th century. This is why this 1844 year of the lash was called the conspiracy of the ladder, because the Cubans would capture these suspected revolutionaries or suspected conspirators and lash them to a ladder, tie them to a ladder, then lash them with 50 or 100 lashes. The conspiracy of the ladder in Cuba. Creolization. It was not merely the climate of the tropics, but also the process of creolization within the peculiar socioeconomic structure of their own creation that surreptitiously undermined the original Europeanness. By the 18th century, this process had led to distinctions between Europeans and Creole whites. Another way of saying it, between Spaniards and Creole whites, Latin Americans or Americanos. At that time period, they referred to themselves as Americans, Americanos, as distinct from Spaniards. Noble families in Cuba. There were 29 titled families in 1810. There was also a wealthy bureaucracy of a mixed group. The difference between these two strata of the white upper class was not great. That is, the difference between Spaniards and Creoles in the wealthy bureaucracy. And the merchant groups was a middling group of merchants and important professionals such as doctors and clergymen. This group included some Jews, Syrians, and Lebanese in the Dutch and British colonies, not so much in the Spanish colonies. Below the upper group of old and new planters and their bureaucratic peers came the middling merchants and the important professionals such as doctors and clergymen. These together formed a third rank within the white sector. Basques and Catalans virtually controlled the trade of the Hispanic Caribbean during the 19th century. Jews, Syrians, and Lebanese were prominent in the Dutch and British colonies, where there was a higher level of religious toleration. Upward mobility for poor whites. It was not impossible for a poor white to become a governor of a colony. What do we mean by a poor white? Suppose someone is a kid is a English lower class, working class kid is kidnapped in Bristol and brought to the Caribbean as an indentured laborer for a term of 3 or 7 years. They would be granted a little bit of land, and they would complete their term of indentured servitude and become part of the population of poor whites. In France, they were called le petit blanc. It was not impossible for them to rise to higher levels. Henry Morgan is an example. He was a poor Welsh indentured servant. He turned into a buccaneer, a privateer, pirate, and he ended his fascinating life as a highly respected planter in Jamaica, and then became the lieutenant governor of Jamaica during the 18th century. Eventually, he was knighted and became Sir Henry Morgan. His life is fascinating and well worth reading about. Slaves could buy their freedom on their own initiative, but the slave system was not entirely inflexible. Nevertheless, the fluidity of the structure engendered internal class friction that contributed to the social instability and made the slave society potentially a revolutionary complex. White class conflict. So part of the